Bruce Wall is a student of life, had a 27-year career in the explosion of informational technologies beginning in the 80s. And I always resonate with Bruce's presentations because they always recognize the spiritual aspect of the struggle. And he was born to missionaries, so that makes sense, I guess. Bruce has been a lifelong student of religion, even has a
Right.
PhD in educating on it, I believe. And it is his passion for peace and justice that has brought him to recognize the necessity of monetary reform. And so, Bruce, take it away.
Thanks, Howard. Appreciate that very much. So I hope you had a chance to look at this. I'm not going to repeat this title other than to point out the fact that it's in 3 acts, but we'll come back to that. So I want to begin with a prelude. I found out that a prelude is the right name for the beginning of a play of 3 acts. Questions of strategy are the animating source of this talk. A strategy for change is only as effective as its understanding of the problem and the power of its alternative vision. Therefore, a robust strategy for monetary reform needs to answer 3 questions. What's the problem? Act 1. What's the alternative? Act 3. What's the change strategy? Act 2. I was born and raised in
Kenya.
there. I was born and raised in Kenya in 1939. That was my wife's voice popping up there. When Kenya was still a British colony, my parents were self-described fundamentalist missionaries who believed the world needed saving. Today, I still believe the world needs, if not a savior, it needs healing from fundamentalized private money capital on the warpath. Let's remind ourselves that what is at stake in monetary reform is nothing less than the well-being of public planetary capital that is threatened by the private mindset of money capital that puts profits over the planet. The arrow in Kate Raworth's Image of the Earth, which I showed at the end of my talk in 2012, and the 9 outside labels indicate the ways in which the status quo of the planet itself is overshooting planetary limits. In the title, I named the problem privatized money capital. Another way it has been named, I saw this sign on a poster at the 2017 Women's March in Chicago, and I thought it was right on. The only dangerous minority is the 1%. Now, perhaps that's not fair to all of the 1%, but nevertheless. Marjorie Kelly, who we invited to the conference and whom I have, you will see, depended on heavily, names the problem, the quote, mindset of wealth supremacy, which is infecting our world. Pogo agrees. We have met the enemy and he is us. The problem comes down to a conflict over our mindset as individuals, communities, as a species towards ourselves, others, and the earth. Trickle-down economics is another name. It is another name for austerity economic policy. And we heard from Clara Matthijs yesterday on austerity and fascism in an incredible story. And we heard Govert this morning in asking the question at the end of, near the end of his talk. So what's the root of the problem? And I was astonished to hear him quoting Jeffrey Sachs, I believe it was, on the mindset. That's to me an astonishing coincidence. The mindset of trickle-down economics is a monomaniacal fantasy of limitless global growth, a mindset, listen to this word, that reveres monetary capital exclusively as a source for the unlimited accumulation of money. It is a corporatized mindset. It's the institutionalized greed of a global class elite, but a mindset, to repeat, that is affecting, or we could say infecting, us all to some extent. What's the result? What I call the top-heavy misallocation of money. Capital and its crusading war machine are sucking the life out of the planet. We could call it finance, but I'm calling it private money capital or private capital wealth supremacy. Wealth supremacists believe that they are entitled, that they deserve everything they have accumulated and don't owe anybody anything. They are proud of their philanthropic altruism, but almost, to quote, almost all modern wealth, real wealth, is the result of a collective and common inheritance owned by no one. By the way, I've got extensive notes with the sources for these statements, so I won't repeat those in the interest of time, but the notes are attached to the document, which is online at the AMI. So what's the alternative to private money capital or private wealth democracy? A democratizing mindset that reveres planetary life in all its capital bounty. Public planetary capital is the subject of Act 3. It refers to the multiplicity of forms of capital that Gwendolyn Hall-Smith calls community capital. I saw Gwendolyn in the audience right now, and I met her in May at the AFJM March for Money this year, and was very, very affected by her. She identifies 10 types of capital, including, for example, financial capital, as well as the human capital of the world-shaping force of the collective human mind. Money, of course, is one form of community capital, but it is only one, and it is only a token, a symbol of trust that can turn in an instant to mistrust. That is how a giant financial conglomerate can be worth billions of dollars one day and must close its doors the next. Using the very real capital of the earth, land, sea, air, and life, to make ever more money out of money, indifferent to the need for the planet itself to regenerate itself, will be fatal if unchecked. This has been a long prelude. I turn now to Act 1. Act 1, I want to continue to look at the problem, but push down to what I see as the root of the problem. What Marjorie Kelly calls the world-shaping mind of the collective embodied, the world-shaping force of the collective embodied mind. Now, in spite of what I was saying to Steve, this is not a sermon, but I do have a text from Marjorie Kelly's 2023 Wealth Supremacy book. And the text begins with these words on page 154 of her book. Dreams matter. Visions matter, for better or worse. Remember that. The collective human mind is a world-shaping force. So too is the human heart, the soul force that has propelled liberatory movements of every kind to their all but impossible successes. Mind, soul, heart are not separate. Her text continues. The abolition movement, votes and rights for women, the global wave of decolonization, and many others, it may be, she continues, that the ongoing dream of democracy, united with the dreams of preserving the planetary commons and advancing racial equity, together can embody the liberatory force that leads into what she calls the next system. The text continues. Remodeling our system begins with what we revere. Values form the moral heart of a social system. This text is first of all a ringing assertion of the collective human mind. It is decidedly not the rugged, self-sufficient, sovereign individual mind of American mythology. Second, it is not the disembodied Cartesian abstraction that dominates modern ideas. Kelly is unequivocal that the mind is embodied, a force that encompasses heart, soul, and body. And third, the force of the mind, its cognitive power and capacity for wisdom, can be used in two completely opposite ways, for better or for worse, depending upon its mindset. The mindset is the direction or default use to which we choose to put ourselves, our beings. Throughout wealth supremacy, Kelly is spelling out two possible mindsets. The world-destroying mindset of private wealth, capital, money, and the mindset of private wealth or money capital. On the other side, the mindset of public planetary capital. In other words, the cognitive power and wisdom of the collective human mind is ambiguous. It can be used for better or worse. Kelly's text occurs at a pivotal point. Up to this point in her book, the focus has been on the pathological mindset of wealth supremacy, a mindset rooted in a delusive set of myths, including the myth that no amount of wealth is ever enough, that expanding wealth is a sacred obligation, that the ecological and societal damages of wealth extraction are not real, and that the first duty of government is to protect wealth. Now, however, when she turns to the alternative, she invokes the same world-shaping force for liberatory purposes. What does all this have to do with money? The purpose of her book is to invoke this same world-shaping force to bring about new ways of being human, new ways of being that embody a new way of using money, as we've been talking about, for connection, belonging, healing, as medicine, and for building trust. A robust strategy for monetary reform must find its roots in an expansive dream, an expansive vision, a planetary mindset rooted in reverence for life. That will be the subject of Act 3.
Should there be a slide turning, Bruce? Or are we okay?
Not yet. Not yet. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's clear that the mindset, I'm still in Act 1, just to be clear. It is clear that the spatial dimension of the threat of a limitless growth mindset that overshoots the Earth's resources is a kind of madness. Amitav Ghosh, the great Indian writer, novelist, but also writer of other kinds of books, called this mindset in his 2016 book, The Great Derangement, which was based on lectures he gave at the University of Chicago in 2016, and I had the privilege of hearing them. What about the time dimension? In The Nutmeg's Curse, which is a book that was published by him in 2021, Ghosh tells this story. But rather than a conventional history, Ghosh gives us a series of 19 historical parables, each one a vignette that takes us back and forth across 4 centuries of wealth supremacist racial violence. It is the story of the, quote, mindset of centuries past that, quote, infused the world of Great Britain and America, the world into which capitalism was birthed. White supremacist racial violence preceded capitalism on this take. Ghosh begins with a vivid account of a massacre that took place in 1621, 4 centuries ago. This is the Nutmeg's Curse that I'm talking about now. This massacre occurred on a tiny island east of Indonesia, halfway around the world from Europe. The massacre, described so vividly, was carried out by Dutch troops under the command of Jan Koon, the Governor General of the Dutch East India Company. In his account of this event, the Dutch officials repeatedly made it clear that they were, quote, under orders to destroy the village and expel its inhabitants. He goes on, the demands are so extreme, so outlandish, that the villagers have no doubt wondered whether the Dutchmen are in their right minds. The people of Solomon will have to obey his orders down to the last detail. Ghosh calls attention to the extremism of the physical violence, amounting to a genocide. More than 90% eventually of the native Bandanese population were killed. The entire local population was driven out or exterminated. The extreme physical violence is evidence, I suggest, of the crusading warrior mindset that has characterized the history of modern Western colonizing imperialism. At this point, Ghosh poses a question to us today. How must it feel to find yourself face to face with someone who has made it clear that he has the power to bring your world to an end and has every intention of doing so? Ghosh is here calling attention to what he calls epistemic violence. What can that possibly mean? It is precisely violence directed against a people's very identity as a people, which includes our sense of who we are as individuals. Ghosh is not alone in talking about epistemic violence. I was shocked and surprised not too many years ago to discover how clear that is to other non-Western thinkers. Boaventura de Sousa, in The End of the Cognitive Empire, the coming of age of epistemologies of the South, is one such example. The famous Kenyan writer Ngugi experienced, quote, epistemic violence at the hands of colonial British agents. He called what happened in Kenya, in East Africa, a cultural bomb exploding in their midst, which, he went on, annihilates a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacities, and ultimately in themselves. Ngugi grew up under colonial rule. He attended high school in Kenya near Nairobi at the same time as I did in the early 1950s, also near Nairobi. Epistemic violence is directed against trust itself, against self-trust, thinking for oneself. George Orwell's 1984 is one of the classic 20th century stories of this sort of cognitive violence. Big Brother was determined to stamp out any hint of trust in any other source of authority. This meant stamping out all signs of thinking for oneself. His was a regime committed to total thought control, punishing, quote, thought crime, unquote, and deploying thought police. It was a society in which orthodoxy meant not thinking, not needing to think. The result was that trust, reciprocal trust among the people, was replaced by terror and a fiction of absolute confidence in Big Brother. Now, this may strike you as paranoid. We associate such extremes with Stalin and Hitler. But Irving Goffman, in a 1961 book called Asylums, should give one pause. Goffman was a highly respected sociologist. Asylum is a solid, sober piece of scholarship about what he called total institutions, including mental hospitals, such as those depicted in the movie starring Jack Nicholson, based on Ken Kesey's novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Also, the first chapter of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, which I'm going to come back to a little later, is another such account of epistemic cognitive violence. These references cannot be dismissed today after the horrors of torture carried out by American military and corporate mercenaries at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Each of these sources is about the terror of power that is determined to stamp out all mindsets but one, to stamp out all independent, distinctive thinking, all perspectives on reality but one, a fundamentalist mindset run amok. Ghosh and Ngugi exemplify the message of the Western powers of modernity in two non-Western peoples, namely that there is only one mindset that is now considered legitimate. All other cultures, ways of life, ways of being human do not count as human, but instead are, quote, primitive, perhaps in fact non-human. The consequence of this exceptionalist stance has been to split the human species in two. Ghosh uses the language of the French scholar of science, Bruno Latour, to describe this act of splitting and purifying, forming the great divide or abyss between the moderns and the non-moderns, or primitive peoples. Latour's interest in science began early. He's a French, as I said, scholar of science, began when he learned firsthand that the French ex-colonizers in Ivory Coast were invoking the authority of science to legitimate white supremacy. His starting question was simple. Are the minds of scientists somehow different from everyone else's? Are the minds of Western enlightened peoples really different from the rest of humankind? That was a question that was in the minds of his fellow former colonists. Ghosh and Latour make clear that the supremacist mindset extends to violence toward the earth itself, violence that treats the planet the same way it treats the other peoples of the earth, as a source from which to extract unlimited wealth for itself, treating destruction of water, air, land, and life with indifference as what the economists call externalities. I want to focus now on the corporations, which has been talked about several times this weekend, the agents that carried out the European crusades to take possession of the rest of the earth. In Ghosh's opening story, the agent of violence is a corporation that was chartered by and thereafter trusted to carry out the will of the Dutch government that legitimated and empowered it, that authorized it. Today, we inhabit what David Seepley, currently the foremost historian and theorist of the corporation, has called a corporate civilization, a world of corporations, including global transnational corporations, which have also come up more than once. Money reformers have reason to suspect that corporations, such as the Bank of the Federal Reserve System, the banks of the Federal Reserve System, do not necessarily carry out the will of their creators, despite the fact that the banks are all agents chartered by the government. In fact, we can no longer make that assumption about any private corporation. For one thing, many transnational corporations are larger economically than many nation states. In 2003, one legal expert on the history of the corporation reported that an estimated 29 of the world's 100 largest economic entities are multinational corporations. The rest of them are nation states. The gross domestic production of sub-Sahara Africa does not equal the revenues of General Motors and Ford combined. More disturbing is the fact that the corporate world claims property ownership rights, known as dominium, even over the merely political rights of the nation state, or imperium. According to the historian Quinn Slobodian, corporate globalists in the wake of World War II were thinking on a global scale and acting, quote, to organize the whole earth. The rest of these are quotes from Slobodian's book, The Globalists. Against human rights, they posed the human rights of capital. Quote, they sought to institutionalize a parallel global regime in which the investor in the corporation, and not the citizen or refugee, was the paradigmatic rights-bearing subject. Today, in other words, the possessive mind of the corporate globalists has been set both on claiming property rights over the state at the macro level and at the micro level, usurping the rights of actual human individuals. To repeat, corporations have been stealing the rights and privileges of individual human persons, the capacities, the rights, the powers that are the bedrock of democratic citizenship. Again, I have a note on this, a bibliographical note. I want to focus in particular, again, on the right to privacy. Specifically, it is the notion that commercial corporations belong on the private side of a line that separates what is called the private sector of the market from the public sector of governmental public institutions. Not only is it taken for granted that commercial corporations are private, the line itself between these two sectors is taken for granted, as is the view that government has no right to cross the line and, quote, interfere with the market economy's natural functioning. In the last half century, the line between public authority and private economy has been policed and extended, and the privatization of the world has been pursued with the single-minded, crusading certainty of fully fundamentalized violence and warfare. At the same time, however, from the other side of the line, that line is in practice non-existent. In other words, the so-called private corporations are going the other way. They cross the line with a vengeance. They now practically own Congress, the Supreme Court, and for 4 years owned the office of the president and furthered what can only be called criminal violence unchecked. What then is the strategy for transformation from one to the other? The answer, I will suggest in Act 2, is the unexamined dynamics of fundamentalization as the basis of fundamentalization. So the basis of a change strategy is what I'm going to present in Act 2. What's the basis for which we can change? And what I'm showing here is what I call fundamentals, fundamentalizing, fundamentalism, and the fundamentalizing dynamic. These names, these words, these cognates, or semantic domain, the semantic domain of fundamentalism, including all of these terms and others, is a notion that I got from a book on the history of trust, the idea of a semantic domain. I consider these concepts to be indispensable to naming the threat posed by private money capital. I'm going to start with market fundamentalism, a so-called secular form of fundamentalism, nevertheless, not a religious in a typical sense. In my opinion, Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, published in 2007, should be the starting point for all future discussion of the concept of market fundamentalism in action. The introduction and first two chapters of Shock Doctrine should be read as the most important theoretical essay to date on the dynamics of a fully fundamentalized ideology of violence. To repeat, Shock Doctrine is anything but abstract theorizing. The opening chapters are followed in the rest of the book by a meticulously documented account of the disastrous history of fundamentalized capitalism, what she calls disaster capitalism, in action, in country after country over the last 3/4 of a century, including in the Near East, in Israel, Palestine. Three signature features of full-fledged fundamentalisms stand out in Klein's account. One is the pure, total, single vision ideology. Fundamentalisms view the world from one and only one perspective that excludes all others. A second feature is the crusading certainty with which fundamentalists seek to impose their truth with a capital T on everyone else. The result is the third well-known feature, a cult-like division between insiders and outsiders. All this adds up to a totalizing movement linked to institutionalized corporate concentrated monopoly power. The fundamentalizing of technology is being driven today by money capital, profit from the already wealthy, for the already wealthy, turning technology into a weapon that is producing what amounts to technological fatalism for everyone else. Fatalism or ideological determinism is today taking shape under the spell of artificial intelligence. I fear it is one of the most extreme and therefore most dangerous and widespread forms of certainty today. It's inevitable, we are told. There's no alternative, as Thatcher said earlier, of the free market. Quote, technologies, however, that in practice are contingent historical experience are regarded as natural, inevitable, predetermined, a matter of fate. The only question that matters is who benefits. All technologies are means by definition. AI for profit is a weapon. To sum up, the attempt to create total trustworthiness, total certainty by any means leads paradoxically to the breakdown of trust. According to the historian Hosking I cited a minute ago on trust, the history of trust, quote, the attempt to create total trustworthiness by means of maximum distrust can only lead to paroxysms of terror. The mindset of total certainty is a mindset of total self-trust. It is the fundamentalizing mindset taken to its extreme, turning the valuable impulse to focus on the fundamentals in any given situation into a curse. I'm coming back to that in a minute. How does this relate to money and money reform? The answer lies in the defining relationship between money and trust. According to Mary Milor, money is trust. According to Robert Hockett, what we call money is a promise. The tokens we call money, tokens, coins, paper, entries in an electronic balance sheet, are trusted promises from someone to someone. However, in the name of the free market, private corporate money power has waged a crusade on behalf of its own monopoly of trustworthiness and against the trustworthiness of the state's monetary authority. Control of money creation and money distribution has ended up in private hands instead of the public's hands. In the last century and a half, we have been witness to the fundamentalization of both state or public power and corporate private power. The result has been a division between the wealth supremacist private insiders and everyone else, namely the global public as outsiders. Now, I want to spend some time with this section B of Act 2 on the dynamics of fundamentalizing. This is the central concern of Act 2, namely the dynamics of fundamentalizing as the key to a strategy for change. My experience of what was for me benign religious fundamentalism as a boy was followed by my experience of militant religious fundamentalism on coming back to the States. That was followed some years later by the rising threat of out of control market fundamentalization of America in the 21st century. Today, fundamentalized private money capital in the hands of the insider class threatens to become a curse to them, to everyone else. Remember King Midas, and remember the nutmeg's curse. This has taught me to distinguish sharply between the importance of fundamentals on the one hand and full-scale fundamentalisms on the other. These experiences have sat side by side subconsciously in my soul most of my life. The relationship between the relationship between them has become acute as I have tried to get down to the fundamentals of terrestrial life, a quest carried out from a body mindset of gratitude for life. This is what has riveted my attention on the paradoxical, ambiguous dynamics of fundamentalization pictured here as an arch-shaped clue to nurturing the mindset of a planetary public. What I call the dynamics of fundamentalizing is a pattern that begins as the life impulse to focus on what matters, what is fundamental. This is the left-hand leg of the arch in the diagram. This impulse is necessary and good and natural, I suggest. It increases up to a point where it reaches what complexity dynamics calls a tipping point. If pursued beyond that point, the impulse to focus can become excessive and switch value from positive to negative, becoming counterproductive and more destructive. We just heard Richard Robbins talk about excess. The reversal or inversion that happens when privacy, for example, is fundamentalized is described explicitly by a historian of corporate liberalism who puts it this way, quote, "Since ancient times, statesmen have attempted to create a polity that could harness private interests to the public welfare. The corporation succeeds, by contrast, in harnessing vast publics to a private interest." That is from Jeffrey Lustig, and again, I have the reference in the notes. The capacity to act on the good and necessary fundamentalizing impulse, I suggest, defines human agency, a capacity that extends to the whole gamut of both individual and collective forms of human initiative and capacities to act. According to the neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist, this is precisely what the left hemisphere of the brain has become optimized to do, in contrast to the right hemisphere. And this is clearly reflected in the remarks of Govert earlier this morning in terms of the bicameral mind. Ian McGilchrist is the latest to take this on. In his foreword to Wealth Supremacy, Edgar Villanueva contrasts in stark terms the way money is used, quote, as a tool to divide, control, and exploit, or as a force for connection, belonging, and healing. In other words, money can be a curse, but it can also be a blessing. You know, we talk a lot about what we do with money. We talk less about what money does to us. We say money talks. It can do much more. It can enchant us, put us under a spell. It can even take possession of us and squeeze the life out of us, leaving us hollow beings. I feel that that's what we've got running for president right now. The two possibilities, the dangerous monosense of money capital and the fruitful capacity of planetary capital, can best be understood, I suggest, in terms of this fundamentalizing dynamic. In Act 1, I've focused on fundamentalization of money taken to its destructive extreme. In Act 3, I will be talking about the fundamental but not fundamentalized systemic capacity of using money as a force for planetary healing and well-being. I will pay special attention again to the sciences again in Act 3, this time as the prime example of the mindset of cognitive power as a gift, a blessing, contributing to our well-being. In this way, the fundamentalizing dynamic is the hinge between the two acts, the dynamic of changing minds. Finally, you may ask, how does awareness of this dynamic guide action? The simplest answer is the almost banal warning against taking anything to inhuman extremes. I hope it will be clear that this danger is anything but banal. A second answer is that the same awareness can open up alternatives, as I hope will be clear. A third answer is that the myth of wealth supremacy can put us in a trance, in a nightmare, or under a spell. Marjorie Kelly says, "My personal awakening from the trance of our system's myths has taken decades. Change means breaking the spell. It means taking possession of our own." My wife kindly brought me some water. Limping upstairs on her crutches. Change means breaking the spell. It means taking back possession of our own minds. It means challenging the authority and legitimacy of the system that has us under its spell by unmasking its myths, exposing them to public view. Understanding the fundamentalist dynamic I suggest can help break the spell. By the way, this is also the point of Kelly's marvelous chapter on, quote, pranks, new naming, and other subversive acts. With that, I turn to Act 3. Act 3 is a call to democratize. The message of Act 3 is the challenge. Planet Earth does not belong to anyone. We belong to the land, sings the song, and the land we belong to is grand. The land, seas, air, and life are public. We, the human species, are agents, not owners, not masters of the universe. And as agent citizens, as human persons, individually and together, not private, artificial, corporate persons, as we, the peoples of the earth, we have been entrusted as stewards, to use one of Steve Walsh's favorite words, with its care. We have also been entrusted with the capacities necessary to carry out this responsibility, including the activities, the capacities of the embodied mind. The image here shows that the neural network of the brain extends to the entire body. In other words, our brain or mind is literally located in the entire body, not just in the skull. Likewise, the capacities of the mind, which we tend to associate with, quote, thinking in the form of reason, are actually almost endless.
Are you showing the image? I think we're not seeing it.
The capacities of the embodied mind. You're not seeing that?
I do.
I do.
Yeah, that, I'm sorry if the image doesn't seem to correspond, but
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
that's all right. I appreciate your honesty. This is a diagram that's basically, I started out to list some of the capacities of what I consider to be the embodied mind: reasoning, calculating, questioning, remembering. I don't think most of us would have trouble agreeing that these are capacities of the mind, but playing with ideas, feeling, those are not necessarily the things, but judging, for example, is a capacity, and so on. Anyway, let me go on. They include in particular playful acts of the imagination, as well as other acts of the imagination which can be dangerous to someone, such as the kind of activity Huck Finn was engaged in, a decision over whether or not he should turn over Jim, an enslaved person, to the authorities or not. Now, if our mind is our body, then our body is our mind. If the mind includes the playful and also dangerous capacities of the imagination, if it includes cognitive passions or feelings, then the gift of cognitive power of human citizen agency is ambiguous. It also includes wisdom. The point of the fundamentalizing dynamic is to help us visualize the positive side of this ambiguity. one more slide to support this claim of the embodied mind. Here's the first 3 sentences, practically, of one of the most important books in my mind from a cognitive scientist, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, in 1999, published Philosophy in the Flesh, The Embodied Mind and Its Challenge to Western Thought. I took it on and got through about 4 chapters and didn't finish it, but I love the guy, and he's continued to publish. The mind is inherently embodied. Thought is mostly unconscious. Abstract concepts are largely metaphorical, meaning abstract concepts are largely ambiguous. I want you to notice the subtitle of this book, The Embodied Mind and Its Challenge to Western Thought. And he means that. Now, the trickster of indigenous American myth, Janus, the Roman deity, Shakespeare's fools, court jesters, all represent the playful and disturbing, the routine and profound, the valuable and dangerous presence of ambiguity that cannot be eliminated from finite human experience. One other gift, or right, or capacity of our fleshly minds is privacy. Privacy is fundamental to its cognitive wise power. This is not a natural feature that belongs to artificial persons like corporations. There is no private class, no absolute, natural, fundamentalized private sector. Only the free private space which makes possible the free exercise of the gift of cognitive wisdom and power of the individual citizen, mind, heart, and soul and body. Therefore, it is our responsibility to act as co-agents of one another in the exercise of this gift, to democratize public planetary capital. The alternative to wealth supremacy and all fundamentalisms is to democratize. Now, to democratize is not an answer. It is a project. As we saw in Act 1, the origins and history of European racialized conquest carried out in the name of democracy and freedom leaves no doubt that the meaning of European democracy cannot be taken for granted. What it means to democratize must be reimagined. To start with the obvious, to democratize means quite simply, as Danielle Allen, an African-American, puts it, neither of 2 parties can dominate the other. In other words, it means to turn the allocation picture of Act 1 upside down. Instead of monopoly concentrations of capital, power, money, and attention at the top, to democratize means to pre-allocate public capital down, pre-distribute, not redistribute, down to the equal and free public citizen agents, individuals, communities, local, state, and regional communities and institutions, such as public banks, public trusts, nonprofit CDFIs or community development financial institutions. The Barber of Little Rock in this image is, by the way, shown with the public trust bank that he created, a CDFI. There's a New York prize-winning 1.5-hour documentary on the Barber of Little Rock. These stand for all sorts of other formations of democratizing. Instead of counterfeit versions of democracy, such as conformity, or today's extreme individualism, or what Maher and Aquino yesterday called the democracy of the market, a democratizing mindset, to the contrary, means the more different perspectives brought to bear on reality, the richer our sense of reality will be, in contrast to the impoverished notion of reality if only one viewpoint is taken as the whole picture. The difference reminds me of the famous fable of the 7 blind sages of India and the elephant, but with a twist. Below are 2 versions of the story as I have imagined them. The 7 blind sages, on discovering, the 7 blind sages on the left, on discovering that each had a different idea about what they had encountered, realized that they should each keep exploring with their hands around until they touched the other one. On the other hand, the 7 blind fundamentalists got into a fight about who was right. Let us imagine the elephant as planet Earth. We democratizers have not reached around to the other peoples of the earth to hear their voices and listen to their perspectives on democratizing. It's time we did. We've been hearing some of them in past AMI and AFJM conferences. To democratize means to adopt the mindset of planetary co-agents, each of us sharing responsibility for the well-being of public planetary capital. Agency means to be entrusted with the capacity to act on behalf of a trusting party, entrusted to represent someone. A democratizing mindset means to be entrusted together with the privilege, responsibility, and capacities of being co-creators of our common world. Such a mindset leads me to the further conclusion that reimagining democracy entails reimagining our ideologically loaded caricatures of socialism and recognizing the affinities between the two traditions. In the last chapter of their book, Maher and Aquino deny that calling for socialist transition is utopian. What they might mean is suggested by the claim that, quote, any green transition will require the state to mobilize the productive capacities currently owned and controlled by private corporations based on a public plan for allocating investment. To me, this sounds exactly like democratizing or democratic socialism. Likewise, a major reason for the importance of Bruno Latour's contribution to reimagining democracy is that he has done so on a planetary scale in his call for a demogenesis, a new operation of engendering peoples. What's my time, Steve?
You have
2 minutes.
No, you got time. You've
Okay.
got time.
I'm almost done. As one aspect, I just wanted to know whether I could include this further comment on Latour. As one aspect of Latour's project, he has been a relentless champion of the cognitive power of the sciences in response to climate denial. In contrast to the unfortunate popular image of him, I shouldn't say popular image, but an alternative image of Latour as anti-science. In fact, he is one of the most important two scientists champion of them, their concern, especially the earth scientists. He has been championing the sciences in the last years of his life in the form of helping to bring about the redesign of the university where he taught. They're redesigning from top to bottom around the terrestrial sciences, his phrase, replacing the counter-democratic, listen to this phrase, trickle-down model of knowledge production, which is what he sees as an enormous approach of the so-called higher education of the West. Latour's work has included further an explicit call for a reimagining, and this is perhaps one of his most important suggestions, of the dominant religious crusading mindset of Western modernity. Here's his last part of his quote. The whole quote's in the footnotes, and I didn't think I would have time to read them, so I'm just reading this part. Quote, to be religious is first of all to become attentive to that which others cling. It is thus in part to learn to behave as a diplomat. A democratic economy is an economy shaped by an embodied mindset of reverence for life, an economy with a heart, heart not shriveled up by reverence for wealth, but a heart and soul wide open to the majesty of planet Earth and life. That's another one of Latour's marvelous words. The majesty of planet Earth and its life. I suggest that this mindset is accompanied by reciprocal trust and gratitude for life. We all start life entrusted to the care of a mother, whether or not that mother is capable of that trust. To be entrusted ourselves with personhood as a gift, a blessing. In the beginning was the gift. It strikes me that this is the note needed to move us, hearts, minds, souls, and bodies, to rise up and seize together the world-shaping force of the collective human mind that belongs to us as healing agents of a torn public planet in our care. I will just call attention to the fact that there's a postscript that I'm not going to read, but it's in the document on wicked problems, which I've talked about in the past and which relate very, very, very much to the notions of the fundamentalizing dynamic and to our concerns with ambiguity in life. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce. That was wow. Even better than I thought.
That's
is
great
there any
coming from you.
questions? Are there any questions about any of Bruce's things? I know it's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it takes a while to absorb. I love the analogy of the elephant. I can see using it. That really works.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That has evolved over the last, I don't know, several years. I've been thinking about it for years, and the final comment didn't occur till yesterday. I was talking about it with Ruth.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Again, I want to point out that this is really important on both the concept of market fundamentalism and the concepts of the fundamentalizing dynamic. I have an enormous bibliography on both because of the importance of those concepts in my talk, and I've been developing this bibliography for several years, so one of the sources I've drawn on is, of all people, Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz. In his latest book on freedom, he actually invokes market fundamentalism and identifies the characteristics of it as a way to talk about, and he talks about its discursive value. So that, to me, was a very important kind of support for developing this notion.
You know, my quick thought is I don't see any questions right now, and I think I won the bet, Bruce. The bet was you would be a minister, and I think you did a good ministerial thing, because when you leave church, you're only left with, wow, I've got to sit with that.
No question.
It's got to last the whole week, so we expect you here back next Sunday. So,
well, I'll have to remind you that my talk last 2 years ago was a response to another minister,
right?
Bruce Rogers Vaughan, who had written a book, Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age, and he was a Baptist minister and a Christian psychotherapist for 30 years. He was a Baptist minister for not that long. So, you know, it's in the blood, I guess.
We value our Bruces.
Yeah. Yes. Well, any last thoughts, Bruce? If you've got the floor a little bit, I gave you extra time because I know you could use it. And if we don't have questions, if you have another thought or two, or
well, I don't need to say any more, and I'm not sure whether this is going to help or hurt. But the point of the postscript, which was relatively short, was here's how I began it. After reading or listening to this talk, you may be experiencing some confusion. So maybe it is appropriate. One source of confusion may be my effort to dramatize both fundamentalized certainty as bad and ambiguity is good. Ambiguity is good. Good because it is the ambiguity of cognitive power that makes agency possible. Susan has her hand raised if you want to. Let's see, I've got about another 2 minutes here if you wanted me to continue.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sue.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay. So Bruce, I did come in a few minutes late, so you might have answered this question. What is your definition of capitalism?
Well, I gave two definitions of capital. One was monetary capital, and the other was planetary capital. And the term monetary capital, monetary-capital, I took directly from Maher and Aquano's book, where it appears not throughout the book, but quite often, money-capital. And I was puzzled. And I did a lot of looking at the footnotes and tracking it down to the German original of a book that they were quoting. And in the German original, the expression was Geldkapital without a dash. Money capital. It's a form of capital. It's a form of money. Okay, and their definition is as I defined it. It's a form of capital that is unlimited. And the contrasting form of capital that I took from Gwendolyn Hall Smith was planetary capital. I guess that was my expression. She calls it local community capital. Multiple forms of capital, which are the earth itself. That is the actual form, that's real capital from which all money is derived. So I did not define, I forget what question you were asking me, whether it was capitalism or capital.
What is your definition
Of what?
of capitalism?
Capitalism? My
Yes.
definition is that it is has been fundamentalized into, I mean, I don't distinguish between capitalism and money capital mindset and institutions and global takeover by the West. It's not just an economic notion. It's as everybody is clear, it's a political economic notion. It's a privatization by the corporate world, so-called private world, of governments. So capitalism is just another word for wealth supremacist takeover, the effort to take over the globe. That's my definition of fundamentalized, 21st century capitalism. There is no such thing as capitalism. It's been a continuously changing term. It's totally ambiguous. Americans considered capitalism good for years. We still do. We still tend to. It's very hard to give up that notion. It's a perfect example of the absolutely fundamental ambiguity of our language. 90%, 99% of our concepts, our words, our language, the tools that we use for understanding ourselves and one another in the world are ambiguous. In fact, I've got a challenge going for anybody to find a single word that is not ambiguous in some context. But that's a rather dangerous challenge. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but that's the best I can do.
Well, I asked it because for a number of years I gave a course in the Lost Science of Money by Stephen Zerlanga. Yeah. And in the middle of the course, one of the students said, capitalism, that's the private control of the money system.
Yeah.
And I said, you're brilliant.
Nice. But it's a lot more than the money system. It's a lot more than the money system. The private capitalism, again, has a history of four centuries. going back to, as I tried to indicate, at least somewhere, again, capitalism. Here's another answer. I 2 years ago, when we were AFJM, I guess, had organized conversations with Liz. I'm blanking on her name. Democracy.
Christine.
Yes, Christine. Sorry, Christine
Desan?
Desan, about the origins of capitalism. And she was going back to the 1700s. And I knew that slavery went back to the 1600s or earlier. So the question came up in my mind, which is earlier, capitalism or corporate takeover, a conquest of the world? And so capitalism has emerged within the context of a larger political crusade that began in the 1600s. Well, no, it began in the 1400s with the Spanish takeover of South America. So that is a more basic kind of, I mean, you know, Govert this morning, I was afraid of the scale and scope of my talk. Govert's talk relieved my fear. You can't beat him in terms of the scale. And he takes his talk back, as you know, to pretty long way. Latour does not just go back to the 14th, 15th century. He doesn't just go back to, he goes all the way back to the emergence of monotheism. What one Egyptian scholar, a very important Egyptian scholar of Egypt, calls the Mosaic moment, the Mosaic divide. And it's the point of it is that prior to, somewhere around that period of time, there was a divide that was related to the sorts of things that Govert was talking about this morning. But again, that takes us pretty far afield.
Thank you for that. Let's get in, John, and I think our time we'll check in. But John, please.
Yeah, hi all. You know, I was on my phone trying to get some definitions because I've seen this before with this group. We have to say, what's your definition of something? There should really mostly be only one definition, and then the communication process will be more streamlined and clear. So I think, you know, going to the dictionary and looking up capitalism, that should be the definition of capitalism.
Which dictionary?
Yeah, well, there, you know, that's splitting hairs, with all due respect. You know, you think you're going to get a decidedly very different answer from one dictionary to the next about capitalism. So it seems like we're making up phrases, myself included. And when I do that, I go astray. If I say, you know, private capitalism, or I put another word in front of capitalism, it just starts to be kind of confusing. So
there's a lot of times, John, I agree with you that we want clarity, and all of us here are trying to find clarity, but we don't have the power of owning the English language to say this is how it has to be. So, for example, when I go around trying to speak about intermediation, or I'm explaining money to people, and I want to get it across how banks should intermediate. But sure enough, I'll walk away from doing what should be pure intermediation, no money creation. And sure enough, I see a central banker in Switzerland saying what they're doing is intermediation. That person was taking a soft definition of it, and I was taking more of a literal definition, trying to be definite, and it wasn't possible. And so we're in a world, especially of this one, where a lot of words are obtuse. and they have the meaning that in our world that we're working to try to change is of economists and their specialized language, the specialized banker's language. And it's a struggle. And so when I saw Sue's question, what is capitalism, in the chat, and I said, wow, that was a loaded question. So anyhow,
I think it's just another word for usury. And money, you think of capitalism, capital is money, ism is a system, it's a money system. It's that money capital system that Bruce was talking about. My feeling is that it is the root of our problems. All the psychological and physical issues that we have today stem from that system.
Let me push back on what Howard just said. Howard, you're great. I love you. But capitalism is not another word for usury. And if we went to a thesaurus and said, what's another word for capitalism, they would not print there that it's usury.
They don't even count usury.
Okay, but I'm just saying.
Gentlemen, we have 5 minutes to get ready for Joe, so let's clear the stage a bit and we'll be on break for 5 minutes. Let's do what we need to do for 5 minutes, and if the conversation carries on, that's perfect too.
John, I'd love to talk to you further.
Yeah. Maybe this keeps going? I don't know. Is it a break, no. Steve?
Yeah, we officially, yes, we're on a break for 5 minutes. In 4 minutes, Joe Polito will give us Canadian monetary history, with some special thoughts in it too. And I think
the speaker and I can speak to each other while we're on break.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to let you know I'd be happy to continue the conversation.
We can do that. Maybe if you know Steve will give you my email address.
You both live in Chicago. You can meet at a coffee shop.
Okay.
Depends on where in Chicago.
It's a big town.
Where are you, John?
I'm on the north side, Jefferson Park.
Okay. Well, we should
define Chicago.
Define Chicago.
Meet at Union Station. Bruce knows how.
I'm on the south side, but that doesn't mean we can't meet.
Yeah, I have a car.
Yeah. No, appreciate your comment.
Okay.
John, isn't the point that capital is, in the sense of capitalism, is the physical things, the machines, the buildings, the excavators, the factories, the tool and dies? Isn't that the capital that's being referred to in capitalism? The people who own the
yes, and we had some similar conversation crop up on another Zoom meeting. It may also include money as some, in some definitions, it does include also money. But like you said,
sure,
factories, bulldozers, etc. And
my house and my car are capital.
Correct.
Asset.
I just want to push back on the idea that there's different definitions. Like, what is your definition of it? I'm thinking there should really be one that we kind of all agree on, so that when we use that word, we know what we're talking about. And I think that in the communication process, if we don't agree as to what it is, then it makes it hard. And if we put other words in front of it, sometimes it obscures what we really mean.
Fair enough.
One would be what, planetary or the Earth capital. Maybe natural resources are included in most definitions. So then,
well, I did give definitions. I had a whole screen on how I was defining both money capital and planetary capital. So I was using both of those expressions in ways that I defined very carefully and very precisely. So I did not, for various reasons, I didn't use the word, I don't know whether I even used the word capital by itself in this talk. I was using it as modified in those, especially in those two ways. And I defined both of those ways. That was one of them. In fact, those were in the title. So if they weren't defined, then I failed. But I
Yeah,
think
those
I
are clear
defined-
because that's the word capital. So you might say, I think you said monetary capital, but then when you add ism on the end, I think
I didn't use that
no,
word.
you didn't, but that's what she asked about. And when we, in this group, when we seem to add the ism on the back, that's when we get like 16 different definitions of capitalism.
Well, by the way, isms are what I consider fundamentalizing things. I mean, all sorts of things get fundamentalized and are turned into ideologies or isms in which single definitions are demanded. So that can be dangerous to insist on one definition and only one definition. So that's part of why this is confusing, why language itself is confusing. But that's another conversation. So it is important to, I don't think it's so important to use one definition. It's very important that when I use a word and you ask me what I mean, I can tell you, even if it's a different one from somebody else's. That is I think maybe the point you're saying. If AMI is going to use the word as a standard word, then we should try to define how we take it for granted to mean. That's a different thing from saying there has to be one definition. Make sense?
Absolutely. And I think on a Zoom, when we screen share, there's usually the ability to do that quickly.
Exactly.
Where you put up a slide and says, when I say capitalism, here it is what really we're talking about.
Exactly.
Bruce, I think Steve is fair to say that. Bruce, is it fair to say that you were really focused on the rent-seeking aspect, no matter which definition you're using, this skimming process, this wealth extraction process?
I think that what I was really focusing on was not any of those things. It was how we think of ourselves, how we think of our one another, how we think of the world. It's it's ideology. It's belief systems. It's how we see the world and how we act on the basis of that. How we understand who we are ourselves. That's my hopeful takeaway from this.
I see my screen says my network bandwidth is low, so I better change location. I'll be back in a minute.
Thanks, Joe, for that question.